painted. The word went round the gilt salon of Harrogate House like a drought, finding every candle at once, and not one of the 200 flames had the courage to gutter. Lady Cassandra Verrigan, in cloth of silver and her grandmother's rubies, said it a second time, so that the dowagers ranged along the wall would be certain of their entertainment. Painted and powdered and dressed in borrowed jewels, that is the whole of the new Marchioness of Ashbourne. A shopkeeper's grandchild in a great house's gown. We are all of us so charmed. She did not say it to the woman she was unmaking. That was the art of the thing, the particular cold craft of the mockery circle, that a woman could be torn to ribbons in the centre of a brilliant room while every blade in the air was aimed, smiling, at the chandelier above her head. Lady Isolde Marchmain stood where they had placed her, at the foot of the long salon under the worst of the candlelight, in a gown the deep clear green of holly. Her gloved hands folded one over the other, her chin level, her grey eyes moving once around the laughing half-circle of beautiful, cruel faces, and then settling, calm, on the middle distance, as though she were looking at something none of them could see. She did not flush. She did not answer. She did not lift one jewel of the rubies they sneered at to touch it and prove it false. Because it was not false, and because a woman who has been underestimated for a long enough time learns that the surest weapon in any room is the one she does not draw. The circle laughed. They thought they had her. They were watching the wrong woman entirely, and they were doing it in front of the one man in 3 counties who had begun, that very season, to watch the right one. If you have ever stood in a bright room and been carved up by people who were smiling, hold on, because this is the story of the night the smiling stopped, and if it earns your respect before the end of it, subscribe, so the next one finds its way to you. Let me tell you who Isolde Marchmain was, because the circle had decided that for themselves, and they had got it wrong in every particular, which is the whole engine of what is coming. She was 24, the daughter of a country gentleman of small estate and smaller name, and she had been brought to London that season as the bride-elect of the young Marquess of Ashbourne. A match that the great families had received with the precise mixture of astonishment and contempt that great families keep for a girl who has risen above her station without first asking their permission. They did not know how the match had been made. They assumed the worst, because the worst was more amusing, and the version that ran round the drawing rooms was that some scheming country attorney had trapped the soft-headed young Marquess into a promise, or that the girl was a beauty who had turned a boy's head, or that there was money somewhere low and grubby buying its way up the ladder rung by vulgar rung. Each of these was wrong. The truth was quieter and far more dangerous, and only 4 people in England knew it, and 3 of them were in that salon. What Isolde Marchmain truly was, beneath the holly green gown and the small country name, was the granddaughter and sole heir of a woman the whole ton had forgotten on purpose, old Hester Vale, who had been born a tradesman's daughter, married twice, buried 2 fortunes' worth of fools, and died the single richest private person in the south of England without ever once being received at a single. One of the houses whose owners now owed her estate more money than they could count. Hester Vale had lent money. That was the unforgivable thing. The thing that had kept her off every guest list for 40 years. She had lent money to the very families who cut her, lent it quietly through banks and agents and other men's names, taken their mortgaged acres and their pledged plate and their signed bonds in the dark, and never once embarrassed them by appearing in the light. Half the marble in the rooms that scorned her granddaughter that night stood on ground that answered, through 3 layers of agents, to the Vale estate. And the largest single debtor of them all, The family whose whole shining solvency rested on a loan from old Hestervale that had been quietly renewed every Lady Day for 19 years was the House of Verrigan. Lady Cassandra Verrigan, who had just called Isolde Marchmain painted, was standing in a gown, in a house, on a fortune that existed at the sufferance of the girl she was unmaking. She did not know it. That was the beauty and the terror of it both. She had been raised to despise trade in the serene certainty that her family's grandeur was its own, freer standing, eternal, and she had never once been told that the floor she danced on was alone, and that the lender's heir had grey eyes and was standing 12 feet away, listening, with her hands quietly folded. Let me take you back, because the wound Cassandra dealt in that salon was not the first cut of the evening, only the one that drew the room's blood, and a cruelty performed that smoothly is always the top of a long staircase of smaller ones. They had been at Isolde for 3 hours by then, the whole brilliant circle of them, in the relay of polite savagery that such women perfect over a lifetime. There had been the moment, on her arrival, when the great doors were thrown open and her name announced and not one head turned, by arrangement, so that she stood framed and alone with 200 backs to her, and had to walk the length of the room to her betrothed through a silence so total it was its own kind of jeering. There had been the dowager who took her hand oh so warmly and held it up to the candle and turned it this way and that, admiring the glove, and said, sweetly, such pretty work, and so clever of you to keep them on, my dear, all evening. One does so hate to see a lady's hands when they have known work. And the circle had tittered, and Isolde had answered, levelly, my hands have known a great deal. Madam, and I find I am proud of all of it. And the dowager had not understood why the line sat so coldly in her stomach, and had moved away. There had been the supper, where she was seated below 3 barons' daughters who had no precedence over a marchioness-elect at all, and had been placed there on purpose to make a point, and where a footman, well coached, had contrived to serve her last and least at every remove, and she had eaten what she was given without remark, and thanked him by name, which unsettled him more than complaint would have, because servants always know which of the great are truly great, and he carried the story to the kitchens that the cruel folk upstairs had got hold of the wrong woman this time, and didn't know it yet. Each of these Isolde took. Each of these she set down without a word in the long quiet account she had been keeping since she was a girl, in the only ledger that ever balances, which is memory, against a day she did not yet know the shape of, but had always trusted would come. Now you need to know the young Marquess, because he is the soft place in this story, the wound inside the wound, and the circle had found him out. Julian, Marquess of Ashbourne, was 21, newly come to his title through the death of a father he had feared, gentle-natured, easily led, and entirely out of his depth in the cold water of the world he had been born to swim in. He had met Isolde the summer before, in the country, when his bolting horse had been stopped at a ford by a plain-spoken young woman who had walked into the river to its bridle and talked it calm, and he had fallen in love with her the way the gentle fall in love with the strong, gratefully, completely, and without the faintest idea of the war it would cost him. He had offered for her against every voice of his guardians, and he had meant it with his whole soft heart, and Isolde, who could have refused and gone home to her quiet acres, had said yes, not because she needed his title, for the truth of her fortune would in time have bought her 10 such titles, but because she had looked at this kind, frightened. Motherless boy being shoved toward a brilliant marriage with one of the very women now flaying her, and she had thought, someone in his life ought to want him and not his coronet, and I am the one person in England rich enough to want nothing else. She had said yes to protect him. The circle had decided She had trapped him. And the cruelty of this particular night was that the circle had spent 3 hours, with exquisite skill, separating the boy from the woman who loved him, flattering him, drawing him off into the card room, whispering to him that he was being laughed at the length and breadth of London for his shop-girl bride, that no man of fashion would receive her, that he had thrown his name in the gutter. Until poor Julian, 21 and surrounded and afraid, had begun to waver, and had not crossed the room to his betrothed once in the last hour. And that absence, the empty space at her side where the boy should have stood, was the real wound. And Cassandra Verrigan, who had engineered it, knew it, and chose that exact moment of his absence to say, "Painted," because she was an artist of timing, and she struck where the armor was thinnest. But here is the thing the circle did not know. The second man in the room, the one watching the right woman. At the far end of the long salon, near the cold hearth, apart from the press, stood the Duke of Carroway. He was the highest-ranking man in the house that night, higher than every title in the mocking circle put together, and he was also the most reluctant, a man of about 35, dark, grave, lean, with a still, scarred, watchful face and the particular hard stillness of a man who had bought his rank with something other than birth. For the Duke of Carroway was a soldier's duke, raised to the strawberry leaves not in a cradle but on a battlefield. A younger son of a younger son who had gone to the wars, a captain of no fortune, and come home. After a decade of mud and blood and a peninsula full of graves, with a chest of medals, a body of scars, and, through a chain of cousins' deaths he had never wanted, a dukedom he wore like an ill-fitting coat. He despised these rooms. He had walked into worse rooms than Harrogate House with a sword in his hand, but the rooms with swords had at least been honest about wanting to kill you. These rooms killed you with a smile and a turned shoulder, and the Duke of Carroway, who had carried dying men 2 miles under fire and counted every one of them more worth saving than the whole laughing circle by the chandelier, had been standing all evening in a slow cold fury that he had let no muscle of his face betray, watching a green-gowned girl with steady grey eyes be torn apart by jackals for the crime of being low-born and proud, and recognizing with a soldier's eye for the one steady figure on a broken field that she was not breaking, and that she was, in fact, by some margin, the most formidable person in the room. He had been introduced to her once, briefly, on her arrival, before the backs all turned. He had bowed to her, properly, fully, the bow a duke makes to an equal, at the precise moment the rest of the room was pretending she did not exist, and she had looked up at him with those level grey eyes and understood exactly what the bow was for, and what it cost a man of his rank to spend it on a country nobody, and she had said, "Lo, you needn't, your grace. They'll only make you pay for it," and he had answered, "I have paid for a great many things, madam, this one I should be glad to be charged for," and had taken up his station by the cold hearth and not left it, and had watched her ever since with a feeling he had no name for, because he had spent his whole adult life unlearning the having of feelings. He did not know who she truly was. He knew only that there was one person of honour in a room of 200, and that she was being savaged, and that something in him that had survived the peninsula intact was waiting, with the patience of a man who has lain still in cover for 6 hours, for the moment to move. The word painted hung in the air, and the circle savoured it, and into the small triumphant silence that followed it Cassandra Verrigan made her one mistake, which was to push for more, because cruelty, like greed, never knows when it has won. She crossed the few feet of polished floor to where Isolde stood, and she put out one white hand and let it hover, not quite touching, over the rubies at Isolde's throat, and she said, gently. For the whole hushed room, tell us true, my dear, before we drink your health, are they paste? One would understand it. A girl of your sort, marrying so high, naturally one borrows what one can, and paste catches the candle nearly as well as the true stone, and who among us would blame you? Only do say, so we may all admire you for your cleverness, and not for your fortune. Which? And here she let the smile widen we none of us imagine you possess. And the circle drew breath to laugh, and the boy was still in the card room, and the trap was sprung as neatly as any trap had ever been sprung in that house of traps. Isolde Marchmain lifted her grey eyes to Cassandra Verrigan's painted triumphant face and held them there, calm, for one long beat that began to stretch past comfort, and then she said, quietly, evenly, so that the whole leaning room had to fall silent to catch it, "They are not paste, Lady Cassandra. They are Burmese rubies of the first water, 9 of them, graduated, set in the old Vale gold, and they were my grandmother's and her grandmother's before that, and they have never once in 100 years been off the neck of a woman of my blood except to be locked in the strong room of Coutts's bank, where the rest of the Vale jewels are, and the Vale plate, and the Vale deeds." She paused. The room had gone very still. "You will not have heard the name. Your family has worked very hard for 19 years not to hear it. It is the name on a great many papers that touch this house, Lady Cassandra, and yours, and I had thought to spare you the hearing of it tonight, as a courtesy from a guest. But you have asked me, twice, before witnesses, whether I am the poor thing you have decided I am, and I find, on the whole, that I would rather not be asked a third time. It was not loud. That was the terror of it. A wronged woman whose shrieks can be pitied and managed and shown to her carriage. A wronged woman who lowers her voice, has plainly come prepared, and 200 people of fashion who had spent 3 hours certain they were watching a kill felt the floor of the evening tilt under their satin slippers a full minute before any one of them could have said why. The Duke of Carraway, by the cold hearth, did not move a muscle, but something behind his scarred grey face came alight, because he had seen this exact thing once before, on a ridge in Spain at dawn. The moment when the force that everyone has written off as broken and routed turns, on ground of its own choosing, and is revealed to have been not fleeing, but drawing the enemy in. He thought, with a soldier's clean joy, she chose this ground. She let them have 3 hours of it on purpose. And he settled his shoulders, the way a man does who has just understood that the battle is not lost but only now beginning, and that he is, thank God, on the right side of it. Now let me take you back 6 weeks, because the night did not happen by accident, and Isolde Marchmain had not walked into Harrogate House to be flayed by surprise. She had walked into it the way her grandmother had taught her to walk into any room full of enemies, having already counted them, weighed them, and learned which of them owed her money. Old Hester Vale had raised her granddaughter herself in a plain warm house full of ledgers after the girl's parents died of a fever within a week of each other when Isolde was 9. And Hester, sharp, secretive, scarred by 40 years of being cut by people who borrowed from her in the dark, had not raised the child to be a lady. Exactly. But to be something the ladies could not imagine and could not defend against, a woman who understood money the way they understood manners, as the true grammar of power. The thing under the thing. "They will despise you, child," the old woman had told her again and again in the firelight, for the very gold that keeps their roofs from falling in. "And they will never once suspect that the despising is a luxury they purchase from you on credit. Let them. Never tell a soul the size of what you hold." The strong woman folds her hands and waits, and lets the proud insist, out loud, in front of witnesses, that she is nothing, and then she has only to open the ledger. Hester Vale had died 2 years before this season, and had left her whole vast quiet fortune to Isolde, with 2 instructions sealed in a letter that the girl was to tell no one the extent of it until life forced her hand, and that on the day she chose to step into the light, she was to do it not for revenge. Revenge is a debt that compounds against the one who takes it, but for something worth the spending. Isolde had not gone looking to step into the light. She had been content, genuinely content, in her quiet acres with her books and her grandmother's ledgers, settling old loans with a generosity that astonished the agents and forgiving small debtors the great families would have ruined. And then she had met a frightened boy at a ford and seen what the world meant to do to him. And she had understood that life had at last forced her hand not for herself, but for him. So she had said yes to Julian of Ashbourne, knowing precisely what the season would be, knowing she would be brought to London and set among the wolves and made to feel every inch of her supposed lowness, and she had let it come. Because she had a quiet purpose the wolves could not see, to stand between this gentle boy and the women who would have devoured him, and to do it on her own terms, in her own time, on ground of her own choosing. She had spent the 6 weeks before Harrogate House not in dread, but in preparation, the way a general prepares a field. She had her grandmother's London man of business, a dry, careful old fellow named Mr. Ferriby, who had served Hester Vale for 30 years, draw up clean, certified statements of exactly which of the great houses owed the Vale estate what, and on what terms, and which of those debts fell due, and which had clauses in them that the spendthrift borrowers had signed drunk or desperate and never read. And at the very centre of that quiet bundle of papers, like a sword wrapped in a cloak, lay the Verrigan bond. The Verrigan bond was 19 years old. The present Lord Verrigan's father, in a bad year, had borrowed an enormous sum from one of Hester Vale's agents to cover a gaming debt that would otherwise have ruined the family before the world, and he had secured it on the one thing he could not afford to lose, not money, which he did not have, but the entail itself. The great Verrigan estate of Harrogate, mortgaged to the hilt under a chain of names so that no soul in society should ever guess that the proudest family in the county held its splendour on sufferance. The bond had a clause. Old Hester had insisted on it, in her dry, malicious way, against the day a Verrigan should ever forget who had saved them, that the holder of the bond might, on any quarter day, with 1 month's notice, call in the whole sum at once, and that if it were not paid within the month, which it could not possibly be, for the family had nothing but the mortgaged land itself, the entire Harrogate estate would pass, freehold, to the holder of the bond. The borrower had signed it because he was drowning, and a drowning man signs anything. His son, the present Lord Verrigan, Cassandra's father, had inherited the debt along with the title and had spent his life paying the quiet interest every Lady Day through 3 layers of agents, and telling himself and his daughter that the family was as rich and free as it looked. Cassandra Verrigan had been raised in the serene certainty that she was untouchable. She had been raised on a mortgage, and the holder of the bond, since old Hester died, was the girl in the holly green gown whom Cassandra had just twice, before 200 witnesses, invited to prove that she was nothing. But I am ahead of myself, and I want you to see how nearly it all went wrong, because a story in which the strong woman simply wins is not a true story. And the truth is that in the 3rd week of those 6, the whole quiet plan came within a hair of being exposed and broken before Isolde ever reached the salon. For Cassandra Verrigan was not a fool. That is the thing people forget about the truly cruel, that cruelty and cleverness keep house together as often as not, and Cassandra had begun, in the weeks before the betrothal, to be uneasy. She did not know why. She knew only that the country girl her father's friends had pushed at the young Marcus did not behave like a girl who had got above herself. A girl who had clawed up out of nowhere ought to be either insolent or terrified, and this one was neither. This one was calm, and a calm enemy frightened Cassandra in a way she could not name. The way still water frightens a swimmer who knows that the still places are the deep ones. So Cassandra did what her kind always do. She sent a man to find the truth and bring it back to be used. She had a cousin, a needy, charming wastrel named Felix Verrigan, who lived on the edges of the family's grandeur and would do a great deal for the price of his debts. And she set Felix to find out everything there was to find about the Marchmain girl's people and money, certain that whatever he turned up would be low enough to finish her. Felix went down into the country, and he was lazy and corrupt but not stupid, and he found, after some digging, a thread that frightened him. He found that the modest Marchmain estate had been quietly clear of all debt for 2 years, and that the agent who had cleared it was a London man named Ferriby. And the name, Ferriby, tugged at something in the back of Felix Verrigan's mind, because he had heard his uncle say that name once, late at night, drunk and afraid, in connection with the family's own oldest and most secret obligation. Felix did not yet know what he had, but he knew it was something, and he knew that something was worth more sold to the right buyer than carried home to Cassandra for a cousin's thanks, and he began, that very week, to make inquiries of his own at certain banks about a Mr. Ferriby and the estate he served, inquiries that, had they ripened, would have laid the whole structure of Isolde's secret bare a full fortnight before she was ready, and a Cassandra Verrigan who knew the truth in advance would not have asked painted in a crowded room. She would have moved against the bond in the dark. With lawyers were Isolde's one great advantage. The public, witnessed, self-inflicted contempt of her enemies could never be brought to bear. Isolde learned of Felix's digging within the week, and here you saw what old Hester Vale had built into her granddaughter, because she did not panic, and she did not strike too soon. The strong do not work alone, and a great house is a nervous system the master never feels, and the watchful feel in their sleep, and Isolde, who treated servants as people, had friends in places the Verrigans did not know existed. A clerk at one of the banks, whose mother Isolde's agent had pensioned out of an old Vale debt, sent word that a Mr. Felix Verrigan was asking dangerous questions about Mr. Ferriby, and Isolde, instead of moving against Felix, did the one thing that would unmake the threat at its root. She bought it. She had Mr. Ferriby quietly buy up the whole sheaf of Felix Verrigan's private debts, the gaming bonds, the tailor's bills, the moneylender's notes that kept the charming wastrel afloat. Bought them for a song because the lenders had despaired of them, and she sent Felix not a threat but an invitation to call on Mr. Ferriby on a matter of business. And when Felix came, sweating, expecting blackmail or exposure, the dry old man laid the whole bundle of his debts on the table, and on top of them one line in a woman's hand, "I hold every note you owe in the world. Carry your inquiries one step further, and I will call them all in on the same morning, and you will be in the Fleet by Friday. Carry them nowhere, and on the day I no longer need your silence, every one of these is burned in front of you, and you walk out a free man." Felix Verrigan was a wastrel, but a wastrel can read a debtor's prison, and he chose the freedom he could see over the reward he could only imagine, and he went back to Cassandra and told her, with every appearance of disappointment, that the Marchmain girl was exactly the nobody they had supposed, small acres, smaller name, a country attorney's plain accounts, nothing there at all worth the journey. Cassandra believed him. Because she wanted to. Because she had a betrothal to wreck, and a kill to make, and no patience left for a cousin's vague unease. The inquiry died, and Isolde, who had come within one greedy cousin and one bought debt of total exposure, did not afterward congratulate herself. She only understood, with a clarity that did not leave her again, that the single thing standing between her purpose and ruin was her own refusal to be hurried into the light 1 hour before the light would serve her. She turned back to her preparations. She had Mr. Ferriby ready the certified copies, the Verrigan bond, the 19 years of interest paid through dummy agents, the fatal calling clause, the chain of names proving who truly held Harrogate, and lodge a second set in London against any chance of accident. She wrote 3 careful, grateful, unremarkable notes to 3 old gentlemen of unimpeachable name and dull good sense. Men who had known her grandmother in the only way the great ever knew Hester Vale, which was as debtors, and who owed the Vale estate sums small enough to be no shame and real enough to compel attendance. She asked only that they do her the kindness of being at the Harrogate betrothal, where she hoped to settle before witnesses certain old questions of property that touched their own peace. Each of those 3 men read her note and felt a small cold finger between his shoulder blades and resolved to come. And on the last quiet evening before the betrothal, when every paper was sealed and every witness placed, and there was nothing left to do but wait, Isolde Marchmain sat alone with her grandmother's letter in her lap, and was, for 1 hour, not a strategist or an heiress, but only a girl who missed the fierce old woman who had taught her all of it and was not here to see it done, and she let the loneliness come and did not run from it, because she had learned that the strong are not the ones who feel nothing, but the ones who feel everything and act rightly anyway. And toward midnight she folded the letter and washed her face, and was the calm, grey-eyed woman again when her own old maid came in with the candle, but harder underneath, and gentler, both at once, the way a person is only after they have looked squarely at the loneliness of what they mean to do, and chosen to do it anyway. So she came to Harrogate House, and she let them have their 3 hours, and she stood at the foot of the salon and was called painted by a woman who owed her everything and did not know it, and she lifted her grey eyes and said, quietly, that she would rather not be asked a 3rd time. And now the night turned, and I want you to watch how she turned it, because she did not turn it the way a wronged woman in a story turns it, with a scream and an accusation and a slap. She turned it the way a woman raised on ledgers turns it, with documents, with witnesses, with an absolute refusal to strike 1 instant before the blow would land where it could not be parried. You speak of the Vale name as though it were nothing. Isolde said into the leaning silence, to Cassandra and to the whole hushed room at once, "Let me tell you what it is." Mr. Ferriby, and from the edge of the crowd, a dry, spare old man in a plain dark coat stepped forward with a green taped bundle under his arm, and the 3 old gentlemen Isolde had written to Drew, without quite knowing they did it, a few feet closer. And the Duke of Carraway by the cold hearth came off the wall at last and moved, unhurried, to a place where he could see the whole field, and Cassandra Verrigan, for the first time that night, felt the small, cold seed of doubt that Isolde had been planting for 3 hours come up green in her chest. "This lady," said Mr. Ferriby in the flat carrying voice of a man reading a writ, "is Isolde Marchmain, only grandchild and sole heir of the late Mrs. Hester Vale, of whose estate I have the honour to be steward. The Vale estate holds, in mortgage, bond, or freehold, the obligations of some 40 of the first families of this country, discreetly and through agents, as has been its practice for 40 years. Among those obligations, and he untied the green tape without hurry, and the small dry sound of it was the loudest thing in the room, is a bond of 19 years standing, executed by the late Lord Verrigan, secured upon the entire entailed estate of Harrogate, upon which this house stands. The interest has been paid quarterly, through 3 agents, to conceal the creditor's name. The principal has never been touched. And the bond contains a clause, I have it here, in the late Lord's own signature, empowering the holder upon any quarter day, with 1 month's notice, to call in the whole principal at once, failing payment of which, within the month, the entire Harrogate estate passes, in freehold, to the holder of the bond. He looked up over his small steel spectacles, mild as milk. The holder of the bond, since Mrs. Vale's death, is the lady you have spent this evening pleased to call Painted. The sound that went through the salon was not a gasp and not a cry. It was the long, low intake of 200 breaths at once, the sound of a whole brilliant assembly understanding in a single instant that the ground had never been where they thought it was. Lord Verrigan, Cassandra's father, a heavy, proud, florid man who had been laughing in the card-room and had come out at the first scent of trouble, went the colour of tallow, because he was the one man in the room besides Isolde who had always known the bond was real, who had paid its quiet interest every Lady Day of his life and lied to his own daughter about the freedom of his house. And he understood before anyone what it meant that the thing he had hidden for 19 years was being read aloud in his own salon. He took 1 step forward and said, This is a private matter, this is not, and could not finish, because there was no end to the sentence that did not damn him. And Cassandra Verrigan turned to her father's grey face and read the whole truth in it in 1 second, and the floor of her life gave way. She had been raised untouchable. She had been raised on a mortgage and never told. She looked from her father's ruin to the calm, grey-eyed woman she had been carving up for 3 hours, and she did the thing that women like Cassandra always do at the end, which is to fight on for a position already lost, because her whole self was built on it and she did not know how to be a person who was not winning. It is a forgery, she said too loud, her painted composure cracking at the corners. It is some lawyer's trick, some country cheat. My father owes nothing. Our house is our own. It has always been our own. And she swung round to the room for support, to the laughing circle that had been her chorus all evening, and found that the circle had gone silent and would not meet her eyes, because the circle had heard the bond read out, and the circle could count, and not one of those beautiful, cruel women was going to stand on the deck of a ship she had just watched hole itself below the waterline. It is no forgery, said Mr. Ferriby, unmoved, and the original is lodged at Coutts's, and a certified copy at the Rolls, against precisely this denial. Your father will confirm it, my lady, if you ask him. I think you will find he cannot do otherwise. And Lord Verrigan, looking at his daughter, could not do otherwise, and his silence was the loudest confirmation in the history of that house. Now the Duke of Carraway moved, and the whole room felt it, because when the highest-ranking man present finally stirs, every other person in a room of rank turns to read him for the verdict. He crossed the polished floor to stand near Isolde, not in front of her, not shielding her, for he had understood by now that she needed no shield, but beside her, at her shoulder, in the open, where 200 people could see exactly whose side the Duke of Carraway had chosen. And he said, in the dry, level voice of a man who had given orders under fire and had no patience left for drawing-room cruelty, I have stood in this room for 4 hours, and I have watched 200 people of fashion spend an evening trying to break one woman who had done none of them the smallest wrong. And I have watched her not break. I have seen a good deal of courage in my life, most of it on worse ground than this, and I tell you plainly, as a man who knows the thing when he sees it, that there is more honour in the green gown at the foot of this room than in all the rest of you stitched together, and that I am ashamed to have been silent as long as I was. He let that land. Lady Cassandra called this lady a shopkeeper's grandchild. So she is. So am I, 3 generations back, if any of you cared to dig, and so are half of you, and the only difference between us and the Vales is that the Vales were honest about the trade that built them, and we have spent a century lying about ours. I would rather dine with one honest tradeswoman's heir than with a room full of borrowers who sneer at the hand that holds their paper. Coming from the first soldier of the age, from a man whose dukedom had been earned in blood while theirs was inherited in idleness, it fell on the salon like a sentence handed down, and the circle that had laughed at Painted an hour before now stood mute and small, and could not lift their eyes, because the verdict of the realm had just been spoken, and it was not in their favour. But it was then that the night reached the place that mattered most to Isolde, the place all her preparation had been for, and it had nothing to do with the bond or the Duke. For the young Marquis of Ashbourne, drawn by the strange, sudden silence, had come at last out of the card-room where the circle had penned him, and he stood now in the doorway, pale and confused, with the wreckage of 3 hours of poison still in his face, the whispers that he was a laughing-stock, that his bride was nothing, that no man of fashion would receive her, and he looked across the room at Isolde standing calm in the candlelight with a duke at her shoulder and a lawyer's writ in the air, and Isolde turned and looked back at him, and the whole question of the night, for her, came down to this one frightened boy's face, because she had not come to Harrogate House to ruin the Verrigans. The bond was a weapon she had brought in case she needed it, and she had needed it. But the purpose, the thing worth stepping into the light for, the thing her grandmother had told her revenge must never crowd out, was standing pale in the doorway. And she watched the circle's poison war in him with everything he knew of her, and she did not move to him, and she did not plead, because she would not buy him cheap. She only looked at him, steady, and let him choose in front of everyone, the way she had let herself be torn apart in front of everyone, because a love that cannot stand the truth told loud is not worth protecting, and she had to know. And Julian, Marquess of Ashbourne, 21 and afraid, looked from the dazzling, cruel circle that had spent 3 hours teaching him to be ashamed of her, to the woman who had walked into a river to save his life and into a wolf's den to save his name, and something in the boy came up straight that had been bent his whole life by frightened men. He crossed the room. He crossed it the whole length, past the silent circle, past Cassandra's ruin, past the Duke, and he came to Isolde and took her gloved hand in both of his and turned to face the room that had been laughing at him. And he said, in a voice that shook and did not stop, "I am marrying her. I knew before tonight that I loved her, and I let you frighten me out of saying it. And I am ashamed of that more than of anything in my life. I know now what she is worth. I knew it at the ford, and I let you make me forget. She did not climb to me. I climbed to her, and I will spend my life climbing, and any one of you who has a word to say against the Marchioness of Ashbourne may say it to me." It was not an elegant speech. It was the speech of a frightened gentle boy finding his spine in public, and it was, to the one person it was for, worth more than the bond and the Duke and the whole vindicated fortune put together, and Isolde Marchmain's calm grey eyes, which had not so much as glistened through 3 hours of cruelty, filled at last and overflowed. Because the only thing she had ever truly wanted in any of it was for the boy to choose her in the open, and he had. She closed her hand around his. And then, because mercy is not the same as omission, and a truth half told leaves the door open for the cruel to crawl back through, she turned once more to the room, to Cassandra, ashen now, and to Lord Verrigan with his ruin on his face, and to the whole circle waiting to learn how far she meant to grind them. And here is where Isolde Marchmain showed what 19 years of her grandmother's ledgers had truly taught her, which was not how to break a family, but how to weigh a debt. "Lady Cassandra," she said, and her voice was gentler now, which was somehow worse, "you asked me 3 times tonight to prove I was nothing, and I have, instead, proved otherwise. And you must feel that you stand in the wreck of everything. So let me tell you what I am going to do, because I think you have never in your life had a true thing told to you plainly, and I find I do not want to be the kind of person your family has been." She let the room hold its breath. "I hold the bond. By its terms, I could call it in on Lady Day, and you cannot pay it. And on the day after my Calmas, this house and these lands and every stone you have sneered from would be mine in freehold, and you would walk out of Harrogate with what you could carry into the road. That is my legal right. My grandmother bought that clause with her own humiliation against this very hour, so that a Verrigan should one day stand exactly where you stand now, and I am not going to use it." The silence that followed was a different silence, the stunned, almost frightened silence of people who have braced for a blow that does not fall. "I am not going to use it," Isolde said again, "because my grandmother, who was cut by your family for 40 years and never once let into your light, told me on her deathbed that revenge is a debt that compounds against the one who takes it, and that mercy is the only kind of victory that leaves the victor clean. So I will hold the bond, and I will not call it in, and your father may keep his house and his name on one condition, which is this, that the quiet cruelty I have been shown in this room tonight ends in this room tonight. Not toward me. I am beyond your reach now, and I want nothing from any of you. But there are 100 girls who will come up to London next season as I came up, with small names and proud hearts, and no duke at the hearth, and no bond in their reticule, and you will not do to them what you did to me. Because I will be watching. And I hold the paper. And the day I hear that the Verrigan Circle has flayed one more friendless girl for sport in a borrowed room, I will call in this bond on the next quarter day, and you will learn, far too late, exactly what it costs to mistake a kindness for a weakness. That is my judgment, Lady Cassandra. It is far gentler than you deserve, and far harder than you can bear, and that is precisely as I intend it. It was the perfect stroke, and the room knew it, because she had not ruined them. Ruin would have made them martyrs, given them a grievance to nurse, made her the villain of their retelling. She had instead left them whole and bound, free and watched, alive on a leash held by the woman they had despised, every comfort of their grand existence now a thing they held at her pleasure and on their. Good behaviour, forever, Cassandra Verrigan understood it, and her face, which had been braced for destruction, crumpled instead into something worse than ruin, which was the knowledge that she had been beaten by a generosity she could neither repay nor escape, that she would live the rest of her life in a house that was hers only because the shopgirl had chosen to let her keep it. She did not faint, and she did not rage. She simply turned, in the dead quiet, and walked from her own salon, and not one of the laughing circle who had echoed her 3 hours before followed her or put out a hand, because the circle had already, with the perfect instinct of its kind, begun to rearrange itself around the new centre of power in the room. And the new centre of power was a calm woman in a holly green gown with a Marquis on one side of her and a Duke at her shoulder. Isolde watched Cassandra go and did not gloat, because there is no triumph in watching a proud woman learn she has been living on charity. There is only the quiet, sad knowledge that this is what cruelty earns. In the end, when it bets everything on the weakness of someone strong. Lord Verrigan came to her then, the heavy, proud man gone humble all at once, and tried to thank her, and could not find the words for being spared by a girl he had let his daughter torment, and Isolde stopped him with one lifted hand, and said only, "Do not thank me, my lord. Teach her. It is the one payment I will accept on the bond, and the interest falls due daily." And she turned from him, finished, to the boy whose hand was still in hers, and to the 3 old gentlemen who had come at her quiet summons and now bowed to her with real respect, and to the dry steward Ferriby retying his green tape with the faintest dry curve at the corner of his mouth, and last of all, to the Duke of Carroway, who had said nothing more since his verdict, but had not left her shoulder. The Duke looked down at her, at the grey eyes still wet from the boy's clumsy, beautiful speech, at the rubies they had called paste, at the whole formidable, composed length of her, and for the first time that scarred, grave soldier's face did something it had plainly not done in many years, which was to soften, openly, with no guard up at all. "Madam," he said, low, for her alone now and not the room, "I came to this house tonight in a duty I resented, expecting to be bored, and I have instead watched the finest action I have seen since I came home from the wars, and I find I am a great deal less ashamed of my rank than I was 4 hours ago, because it has at last been some use to someone who deserved it. You will marry your Marquis, and you will be the making of him, and the whole brittle world that laughed at you tonight will be calling at your door inside a 12-month, begging to be forgiven, and you will forgive them, because you are that sort, and they will never deserve it." He paused, and the corner of his hard mouth moved. "I have no claim to make, and I make none. You are spoken for, and rightly. I ask only the honour of standing your friend. A duke is a tiresome thing to be, but it opens doors, and I should like to open every door in London for you and your boy, and watch the faces of the people inside when they see who walks through. Will you let me? It is the one entertainment I have looked forward to in 10 dull years of peace." And Isolde Marchmain, who had been despised for the gold that kept their roofs up, and underestimated for the strength she folded out of sight, and torn apart in a bright room by people who owed her everything and knew nothing, looked up at the first soldier of the age offering, plainly and without a price. To be her friend, and at the gentle, frightened boy who had found his courage for her in front of the world, and at the whole turned, silenced, rearranging room that had come to watch a girl destroyed, and had stayed to watch her become the most powerful woman in it, and the calm she had worn like armour all evening eased, finally, at the corners of her mouth into something that was not quite a smile, but was the warm ground a smile grows from, and she said, "Your Grace, I have spent my whole life among people who wanted my fortune and feared my name and saw nothing of me at all. A man who wants nothing and sees everything and offers only to open doors and enjoy the faces, I think I should like that friendship very much. But the first door you open had better be the one out of this room, for I find I have had quite enough of grandeur for one night, and I should like to take my Marquis home." He laughed, a short, surprised, rusty sound, the laugh of a man who had not used it in a long while, and he offered her his arm on the one side, as the boy held her hand on the other, and the Duke of Carroway and the Marquess of Ashbourne walked the Marchioness-elect down the whole length of the brilliant, silent salon, past the dowager who had admired her gloves, past the baron's daughters who had been seated above her, past the cold hearth and the green-taped writ and the empty place where Cassandra Verrigan had stood, and out through the great doors into the cool night. And the dry steward Ferriby followed with his bundle under his arm and his chin high, and behind them 200 people of fashion stood in a hush far worse than any judgment. Because they had assembled to watch a country, nobody flayed for sport, and they had instead watched, with their own eyes, the slow, magnificent revelation that the nobody held the paper on half their lives, and that she had chosen, out of a strength they could not imagine, and a mercy they did not deserve, to let them keep them. Isolde did not look back. She had inverted the room entire. The woman who had walked the length of the salon to a silence meant as mockery now walked it again to a silence that was awe, and the difference was only that this time everyone present knew exactly what she was, and exactly what she could have done, and exactly what it had cost her not to, and that, her grandmother had told her once by the fire, is the only revenge worth having, not to ruin the proud, but to hold their whole world in your open hand, and let them watch you decline to close it, and live for ever after on the knowledge that they are spared not by their own grandeur, but by the kindness of someone they swore was nothing. She married her Marcus in the spring, in a country church near her quiet acres, with the Duke of Caraway standing as a witness, and the 3 old gentlemen in the front pews, and Mr. Ferriby, dry-eyed and proud at the back. And not one of the laughing circle invited, though every one of them, before the year was out, found a reason to write and beg the favour of being received. And she received them, in time, one by one, exactly as the Duke had said she would, because she was that sort, and because there is no sweeter weight to lay on a proud person than forgiveness they cannot pay back. She was the making of Julian, and he grew, under her steadiness, into a far better man than the frightened boy in the doorway, and they were, by every account, happy. And she kept the bond. She never called it in. She kept it in the strong room at Coutts's beside the Vale rubies and the Vale deeds, an unfired weapon, a held breath, a whole great family's solvency folded quiet in her hand, and the Verrigans were courteous to friendless girls for ever after. Scrupulously, fervently courteous. Because somewhere in the south of England a calm, grey-eyed woman held the paper, and the interest, as she had told them, fell due daily. The strong do not announce their strength. They fold their hands, and they wait, and they let the proud insist out loud in front of witnesses that they are nothing. And when the proud have finished, and the bright room is leaning in to laugh, you have only to lift your eyes and tell them, very quietly, the name on the paper, and let the truth do what the truth always does when it is finally let into a candle-lit room full of people who were so very sure they knew you.